You're listening to Decisive Point. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and are not necessarily those of the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army War College, or any other agency of the U.S. government. I'm talking with Major Zachary E. Griffiths today. Griffiths is the author of Are Retired Flag Officers Overparticipating in the Political Process?, which was first published in Parameters in the spring of 2020 and was republished in the winter 2023-24 issue. Griffiths is a graduate of the United States Military Academy and Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a special assistant to the Chief of Staff of the Army, focused on renewing professional writing. Welcome to Decisive Point, Zachary.
Thanks, Stephanie, for having me.
What inspired you to conduct the research your article is based on?
In the summer of 2016, while I was in grad school, I had an opportunity to sit down with retired Admiral Stavridis. He was then a candidate for vice president with the Clinton campaign, and he seemed so motivated by a genuine desire for public service. But then a year later, I arrived at West Point to teach American politics, and I was struck by the negative view of political participation by retired flag officers. It was in our lessons on civil military relations. It was kind of hard for me to square these two things, right? Admiral Stavridis' passion for service, and then kind of the way we were teaching it. That tension led me to write 2 scholarly articles, and then kind of a whole mess of commentary focused on these 2 questions I was grappling with. The first question was about their intent. I thought it might matter whether they were doing it for good reasons, making these choices to participate. And so that led me to write an article in Armed Forces and Society called Not Putting Their Money Where Their Mouth Is, Retired Flag Officers and Presidential Candidates. And that article matched campaign contributions and endorsements by retired flag officers, concluded that most retired flag officers endorse because of solidarity reasons, like their friend asked them to, or they feel an affinity to their peers. About 20% maybe working at ideological goals, and about 1% maybe trying to advance themselves materially or get a government position. The second was about why commentators fixated on these endorsements and criticized them so much, which is what this article is about. I saw that retired flag officers, they run for office, they serve as appointees, as General Mattis and General Austin did as Secretary of Defense recently. They give money, they serve on boards, they write op-eds, but only these endorsements are routinely and publicly criticized. Most notably in 2016, Admiral Retired Mullen and General Retired Dempsey both wrote and commented, said, hey, this is bad. Flag officers should not participate this way. And General Dunford, as the sitting chairman of the Joint Chiefs, also spoke on the same subject. So that led me to look at how they participate in politics, how retired flag officers do, and to try and figure out what made endorsements special and deserving of criticism. As part of the background for this research, I located 3 potential harms people talk about, the reasons why they might be bad. First was that their endorsements might undermine the trust of political leaders in military leaders. So the president might not trust the advice from generals, or Congress might not trust advice from generals. It also might undermine public trust in the military. So people like me and you, if asked how they feel about the military, may feel worse about it. Or it might politicize the military, which would increase the political or partisan behavior by service members. Maybe it's like more bumper stickers or more giving up money.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that of all the ways the retired flag officers participate in politics, endorsing is what draws the most negative attention.
Retired flag officers participate politically in nearly every way, but only this endorsing draws criticism. So my approach was to find evidence that at least one flag officer participated in a whole bunch of ways, just to show how do they participate, and then look more at the question of endorsements. First of all, we shouldn't be surprised that retired flag officers participate. They are citizens with all the attributes of active people. They have money, they have status, they're educated, they understand politics, they possess social networks, etc. And after they retire, they may decide to act politically on their own. Others might encourage them to participate, or they might abstain. These are all things that they might choose to do. To characterize their participation, I wanted a pretty comprehensive definition of what participation looked like. And so I settled on a typology that had 3 categories. They could do either as individuals or groups. The first category is non-participation or abstention. It is a political act to not participate politically. But individuals might abstain by not voting, or they may actively non-participate by telling other people not to. So General Dempsey's op-ed, or the one by Admiral Mullen on endorsement, this is an example of active non-participation. The next category is civic participation. So this is generally aimed at trying to make the world better, but not through political means. As leaders in social networks, retired flag officers might draw attention to their pet causes. Major General John Batiste did this with a fundraiser on post-traumatic stress disorder, or they may join advocacy groups that bring attention to social causes as a group. And then there's a civic participation side of this, which is about persuasion rather than just drawing attention. So I find that flag officers do basically all those things. The third category is formal participation, and this includes basically direct participation in the political process. And so that might be voting, giving money, or joining a group that does that. Flag officers do those things as well. Informal participation is about persuading political leaders, and this is where endorsements fit in. Some flag officers are noteworthy enough that their individual endorsements matter, like General McChrystal endorsed Congressman Seth Moulton for his run. That's an example of an individual endorsement. And there's the collective ones we're talking about today that draw so much ire. Finally, there's also illegal participation, and I didn't find any evidence of that by flag officers during that time period. So of all the 14 combinations in my typology, retired flag officers participated in 11 of them. Of those 11, only endorsements as a group drew this ire. Why might this be? I suspect that people only notice endorsements because they have these long lists that get in the media and news, and so then they draw criticism.
What's the impact of political endorsements by retired flag officers on civil-military relations?
I found no evidence for any of the three harms that we discussed, or very little evidence. The three were undermining political leader trust in military leaders, undermining public trust, and politicizing the military. On that first one, undermining political leaders' trust in military leaders, I review a paper written by a PME student that looked at 6 case studies. Of the 6, only the case where retired Admiral Crowe endorsed President Clinton is there any evidence that there's issues here. And Bush says of Crowe, I was pretty disappointed in Bill Crowe because Crowe had worked directly for Bush. And then as soon as Crowe retires, he endorses Clinton. That would hurt. Probably similar, if you and I were good friends and then you turned around and burned him, right? So, but this is I think, a personal thing here. The second point was about undermining public trust in the military as nonpartisan. And as these endorsements have climbed between 1988 and today, so has the public trust in the military. I did a linear regression. I found that each additional endorser was associated with a 2.6% increase in public trust. There's really no evidence that each increased endorsement is associated with a decrease in trust. Public trust sense has kind of come down a little bit, but it doesn't seem like there's any causal connection. The third point was on politicizing the military. There's not a ton of recent studies on this, but Jason Dempsey and Heidi Urban both did polls of political participation by military leaders in 2004 and 2009. Those 2 polls correspond with the years of the highest number of endorsements, which was 2004 had 343, 2008 had 311 endorsements, and political participation, voting, giving money, etc. And so we don't really see much evidence that endorsements are leading to changes in political participation by military leaders. Across all those 3 categories, there's really not much evidence that these endorsements are moving the needle, except maybe in cases where there's a personal relationship.
Do you think there will be more endorsements just given how emotionally charged this election year seems to be?
In my paper for Armed Forces and Society, what I found was that candidates that seek out these endorsements get more. If they mobilize and they really want them, they'll get more. I am quite curious to see the number of endorsements that President Trump gets this year. In the first year he ran, he had a relatively low number for a Republican. I suspect this year we might see a return to greater numbers of endorsements as a Republican candidate, especially if his campaign seeks them out. I think it's more about whether the campaigns think the endorsements are important than about maybe the nature of the election that year.
That makes sense. That's fair. Do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap this up?
I think there's probably 3 concluding thoughts I would share. The first, I think, is really the most important, is that just because endorsements are not harmful, it does not mean that they're good. If someone were asking me if they should join an endorsement letter, I would say no. There's some papers by Peter Fever and Jim Golby that look at whether flag officer endorsements help get people elected or whether they inform public decisions about use of force. And the answer is no in both cases, or at a very small effect. This suggests that retired flag officers make these endorsements, which might harm civil military relations, but almost certainly do not affect public policy. If there's no benefit and there's a potential cost, it's probably not worth doing. The second point, we're heading into another presidential election year this year. I will be watching and try to comment on what happens. Senator Tuberville's holds this year may have caused some mistrust, and I'm not sure what impact that might have, but we're going to see President Biden and President Trump competing again. I suspect we'll see pretty even numbers of endorsements to both parties. In 2016, Secretary Clinton slightly exceeded President Trump's number of endorsements, and in 2020, President Trump moderately exceeded President Biden in the number of them. But I suspect we'll see pretty even endorsements to both parties. And then finally, I just want to take a moment to talk about the work I'm doing for the Chief of Staff of the Army right now. I lead the Harding Project for him, which is an effort to renew professional writing in the United States Army, of which Parameters and SSI are great partners. I encourage you to check us out at hardingproject.com, or please do feel free to reach out and send me an email, write for your professional bulletin, for your branch journal, and get involved.
Listeners, you can read the article at press.armywarcollege.edu/parameters. Look for volume 53. issue 4. For more Army War College podcasts on similar topics, check out Conversations on Strategy, SSI Live, and A Better Peace. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, you can find us on any major podcast platform. Thank you so much, Major Griffiths. This was really interesting.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.